All right, I'm continuing on now through my investigations into Rudolf Steiner's last great lecture cycle, Karmic Relationships. I'm nearing the halfway point of Volume 2, in which Steiner continues his investigations of the past lives of famous European individualities. Now, last time we had mentioned, we had seen how all of these Islamic individuals had reincarnated as various Western scientists and thinkers. We saw how, for instance, Harun al-Rashid, the great caliph at the court of Baghdad around the year 800, reincarnated as Francis Bacon and brought a materialistic influence into Western thinking at that time. And Bacon was a huge founder. He played a role in the founding of the Royal Society and new ideas about education. But what Steiner says now, he resumes this and he said, at the court of Harun al-Rashid, there was another individuality. He doesn't give the name, but who would have been the Islamic equivalent of a chancellor, one of Harun's most trusted men, and who was extremely learned and erudite, knew astrology, and all of these things. This individual then reincarnated alongside of Harun as Francis Bacon as John Amos Comenius, who, if you do a Wikipedia on Amos Comenius, it'll come up as John Amos Comenius, who is known as the father of education. And so what Steiner does for a while here in these chapters is to focus on how two individualities who are karmically entangled with each other can keep reincarnating. So we get Harun and his chancellor both together reincarnating as Francis Bacon in England and Amos Comenius in Czechoslovakia. So he was in Eastern Europe. And Comenius, I had never heard of him prior to this lecture, is extremely obscure, but he is regarded as the father of education. And he was a mystic. Unlike Bacon, he was a mystic. He had come out under the influence of Jakob Burma. But he was the author of a doctrine known as Pan-Sophism, which has to do with the idea of all learning. Everyone should be educated, according to Amos Comenius. And he founded this idea that education should be universal for men and women both, as well as there should be no barriers. Poverty should not be a barrier to education. Your economic status, your social status, racial status, none of those things should be barriers to Comenius' idea of universal education here. And he also introduced the idea of textbooks written in the vernacular, not in Latin, but in the local vernacular language, with lots of images in them to give them concreteness. So we owe a lot to Amos Comenius here for founding this idea that everyone should be universally educated. And both of these individualities then are living contemporary with Shakespeare. And as re the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy, Steiner says, no, they were two totally separate individuals. And so here they are. And Bacon's influence is working from west, from Britain to east, as his influence with his ideas about establishing a universal learning are migrating from west to east, whereas Comenius' ideas then are migrating from east to west in the opposite direction. And indeed, Comenius himself eventually wound up in Holland, and then he was in London at some point prior to the outbreak of the Civil War there, and then left. So these two ideas then reincarnate, working from where they had previously been Islamic individuals, and now they're entering into the West, changing the standards and ideas of education, Bacon leading to the founding of the Royal Society, and both of them exchanged letters back and forth. So they knew and were aware of and respected and appreciated each other's influences. So then Steiner goes into this thing about how after they both die, and they go through what he calls the gate of death. Steiner's always referring to this as when one individual leaves and goes through the gate of death. On the other side, each one of them had a number of pupils on the other side with whom they interacted, and from out of which they had influences on certain individualities who then reincarnated as a couple of historians in the 19th century. And he says that what happened was that Harun al-Rashid, also known as Francis Bacon, when he got to the other side, influenced this historian who was born in the 19th century as Leopold von Ranke. And apparently von Ranke was a big deal. He was the one who introduced the whole idea of modern historiography with its emphasis on textual citation and primary documentation. Von Ranke was very insistent and being very critical about sources. That was Ranke's thing. And he was very insistent on primary sources, going to the archives and digging out the documents of royal personages, reading their private letters. He was very insistent on that. And he was kind of a micro-historian, a bit like Foucault in a certain sense, where he was interested in all these micro-histories, very narrow, specialized areas, such as he would write a history of the 17th and 18th century Habsburgs, or all these various, very specific tracts and treatises. So he's introducing Bacon's, the influence of Bacon upon him is the emphasis on the concrete, on the empirical, on the material world, bringing that in. Whereas the historian, who on the other side had been a pupil of Amos Comenius and was reborn also as a German historian, Friedrich Schlosser, a historian who's now completely obscure to us now. But apparently Schlosser was the big historian just prior to von Ranke coming in and becoming popular. Schlosser was the great moralist historian. He was kind of an idealist and a moralist, but he wasn't critical with his sources. He started off in 1812 writing a book about the Byzantine iconoclasts, and that's one of the first important works, other than Gibbon, one of the first important works on the history of the Byzantine iconoclasts. So that made him famous. And then he spent his career working on a very large history, a world history for the German people, which he never finished. But he was sort of an idealist, and his career was then eclipsed by the popularity of von Ranke. And so that's how these two, the Francis Bacon, Amos Comenius individualities influenced these two guys who were reborn or who came into being in the 19th century. So there's this idea that Steiner wants to get across that individuals can become influenced on the other side even before they incarnate and come in to the physical world with a bias, with a preconceived idea that they've already picked up from the other side, and not even from past lives. He doesn't mention who the past lives here of von Ranke and Schlosser were. So I find that interesting, how complex the architecture of all of this is. So I mean, if Steiner is a mythologist, and this is how I originally read this, like he's just sort of making this up as he goes along, like Tolkien made up this whole elaborate universe with its own language. It's indeed very, very, very elaborate. I suppose it is possible that he could be making this up, but I doubt it. There are just too many interesting details for that to be the case. And then so, moving on then with this concept of pairs of individuals who reincarnate, he gives us a glimpse into the past lives of Marx and Engels. So he says that Karl Marx was, in the 9th century, this individuality who was a feudal lord who owned who owned land and an estate under the conditions of feudalism, where you have individuals working for you as serfs, and they're indebted to you for life. And so he owned this estate, but he was also an adventurer and a plunderer. And he would take private armies with him and go marching across Europe. He says all of this took place in northeastern France at this time, and he would go marching across France, plundering other people's property, taking their goods. But then that when he returned back to his estate one day, he found his estate had been taken over by the individuality known as Engels, had taken over his estate, who was another plunderer and adventurer, and for some reason the Marx individuality had lost his power while on one of these campaigns, so he was reduced to having to be a serf on his own estate, ruled now with his overlord, the Engels individuality, to whom Marx was now beholden, and he began to foment amongst the other serfs, who were basically slaves, more or less, discontent. What Nietzsche always used to quote from the French Chrysanthemum, discontent, resentment against those in power. And this had gradually led him to want to overthrow the individual, but I don't think he ever did. Steiner doesn't say that he actually rose up and took his estate back, but perhaps he did. Nonetheless, it provided the karmic motivations for those two to reincarnate in the 19th century as Marx and Engels, with Marx evolving his theory of communism as a way of continuing that sort of lust for overturning the bourgeois, the owners, with the revolt of the proletariat. So that's where the karmic relationship comes from. I find that to be very amusing, actually, and full of irony. If this stuff is true, there's a sense of humor to some of this. I think the universe has a very ironic spirit. And I especially like this next pair. So then he moves into the past lives of two great Roman writers, Pliny the Younger and Tacitus. Pliny the Younger was the nephew of Pliny the Elder, and Pliny the Elder was the one who wrote all the books about natural science and collecting curiosities and so forth. Both Pliny the Younger and Tacitus lived in the 2nd century A.D., and Pliny the Younger wrote letters. He was a very universally educated individual, wrote lots of letters. Tacitus liked him. Tacitus was a very great Roman historian, one of the last truly great Roman historians, who wrote about, he's famous for writing the earliest treatise about the Germans, called Germania. It's the earliest, it's a short little, very readable text. I highly recommend it, where he talks about the early German organization of their tribes and the way that they were, how bad they were at agriculture, how they preferred hunting, the types of spears that they used, and all these wonderful details about some of their gods as well. Tacitus's account is the earliest one there. But he also has the Annals, the famous history of Rome, where he talks about the atrocities committed by the various Roman emperors and so forth. Suetonius was also part of his entourage or retinue of writers. But Tacitus and Pliny were very good friends and wrote back and forth to each other. But when they reincarnated in the 11th century. Pliny the Elder reincarnated as a woman, known as Countess Beatrix, who was associated with the famous castle of Canossa that has a connection with Henry IV, where Henry III, in her time, she was married to a man apparently named Gottfried, and Henry III conquered him, drove him out. He was one of the Holy Roman Empire rulers at this time, drove him out and took Countess Beatrix captive with him back to Canossa, where she became, she was a very learned individuality. Naturally, having been Pliny the Younger, she still had an aptitude for learning. She was a very observant individual. And the castle of Canossa then becomes famous for Henry IV, who had to make a pilgrimage there to humble himself because he had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. They got into a very power struggle over who was more supreme in the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor or the pope. And Henry IV thought that it would be him, but he got excommunicated and he lost credibility amongst a number of the German political factions. So he had to make this pilgrimage to the castle during the winter, and he had to wait outside the castle for 3 days. They wouldn't let him inside the castle. The Pope was there with a woman named Matilda, who was the daughter of Countess Beatrix, and guess who Matilda was? Nonetheless, then Tacitus. Tacitus reincarnates as Matilda, the famous daughter of Countess Beatrix here. And so he has to wait, Henry IV has to wait outside for 3 days. He's doing penance, he's wearing a hair shirt, he's barefoot, he's fasting, he's not eating anything before the Pope finally agrees and lets him come in and brings him back into the church. So Tacitus was Matilda. Now very often with karmic relationships, they can do this. You get two individualities that just like to bounce off of each other's energies. They just like that for one reason or another. And they like to reincarnate over and over again in different shifting roles. They might reincarnate as best buddies. They might reincarnate as husband and wife. They can reincarnate as a father and a daughter. It doesn't even matter what the biological bondages are. The relationship is always about karmic discovery of each other's energies and finding out all these various modalities and working out the difficulties of karmic relationships between individuals. So we have then Tacitus as Matilda, also a very learned woman, very observant and learned, and we have her mother. And then they reincarnate again, these two, in the 19th century. Pliny the Younger reincarnates actually as Hermann Grimm. Hermann Grimm is the son of Wilhelm Grimm, from Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, the famous Grimm brothers, who wrote so much about German folktales and Grimm's fairy tales and so forth. And so he reincarnates, Pliny the Younger reincarnates as Hermann Grimm now. And he's inherited this academic writing style from his father, Wilhelm, that's very stiff and formal, and he never really felt that it expressed him who he truly was. And then he encounters the writings of Emerson. Emerson, I guess, was popular in Germany at the time, and so he discovers Emerson, and he's like, this is perfect. This is exactly the kind of lush, romantic style that I want to be writing in. So under the influence of Emerson, his writings begin to change. He was apparently a historian. So his writings begin to change, and the style becomes more romantic under the influence of Emerson, and he's really wants to meet Emerson. And Emerson is, of course, Tacitus. Tacitus now has reincarnated from Tacitus to Matilda to Emerson, and they do indeed eventually meet, and apparently they had a very good, enjoyable relationship, influencing each other's writings and works. So those are three incarnations of two individualities who start off as Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, and then reincarnate again as Countess Beatrix and her daughter Matilda, and then again as Hermann Grimm and Emerson. So the people that the larger picture that I'm starting to pick up from this is that the people that you encounter in your life are not accidental at all. There is nothing random about the encounters that you have with other people. Chances are you've had a karmic connection with them at some point in the past, even peripheral people that you've never actually met, but who might be a relative of somebody else, you could also have had a relationship with in the past. Because Steiner says, and I think that my researches with Shruti Campbell into the afterlife and the other side, that people reincarnate in groups. They tend to cluster together in groups. Families do this a lot. In-laws often, who are hostile or antagonistic to each other, have often played karmic relationships with each other. So this is a vast, intertangled, interconnected meshwork of incarnations that we're all going through to try to learn from each other and play off each other, trade favors. You might owe someone a favor from a previous life who helped you out, just as we saw last time with Schubert and Baron von Spahn. I'll finish up here with one more life that he gives, although this is not an example of a pair. It's an example of Steiner's starting to move into an illustration of how karmic balancing works, how good and evil works. It's not exactly ethical in the strict sense of a punishment, like we said last time. You commit a crime and you get punished. It's not that kind of a thing. It has to do with karmic balancing. The soul is always seeking to balance. If you were a murderer one time, chances are you're going to be a victim on the other side next time, and it's balancing. So we have Nero, the famous Roman Emperor Nero, who was famous for his cruelties. He had a lot of people killed under his reign, the conspirators at his court. He is supposed to have started the Great Fire of Rome and was said to have burned down Rome just so that he could rebuild it the way that he wanted it, with his theater put in place. He was, by all accounts, a very bad emperor, a very cruel, tyrannical individual. And he was killed, or he had to commit suicide after he was tried in absentia by the Roman court as a public enemy, and so he was forced to kill himself at the age of 30. So he reincarnates, Steiner says, as an unimportant, non-famous individual, possibly a soldier, who later was told to go and commit atrocities under orders to do so. So he had to experience the karma of committing atrocities under no free will. Whereas under Nero, he had committed atrocities out of the pure freedom of his will and the pleasure of cruelty. And now he had to experience it possibly as the soldier who was just carrying out his higher-ups' wishes, now had to experience the moral conflicts that come into being with that, being told to do atrocities that you have to do because you're a soldier, so you have to do what you're supposed to do. So he had that incarnation, and then he says the next incarnation that he has was as the crown prince, the Austrian crown prince Rudolf, who near the end of the 19th century, I think this may have been 1889, also committed suicide at the age of 30. Both Nero and Crown Prince Rudolf committed suicide at the age of 30. Note that. That's a Saturn cycle in astrology, 29 years with a general orb of about 2 years, 29, 30, 31 for your Saturn return. And it's usually marks a threshold in your life. You're not the same person after your Saturn return as you were before it. It's a big threshold. So neither one of them survived it. So apparently as this incarnation of the Crown Prince, Austrian Crown Prince Rudolf, Rudolf had everything going for him. He seemed to be talented, wonderfully talented, and he was about to inherit the empire, the Austrian Empire, and until he got into an affair. He was 30 with a 17-year-old woman, who was apparently, it was a love-death relationship with, at some point, I don't know what the details were, it'd be interesting to know, but at some point their affair got very dark, and Rudolf had bought a hunting lodge, the Meyerling Hunting Lodge, and apparently they both committed suicide together in a kind of Tristan and Isolde love-death pact, and they committed suicide together. And there were some doubts about this, whether it was a mutual suicide, until recently, 2015, letters written by the girl have been unearthed saying that she was preparing to commit double suicide with her lover, Rudolf. And so Steiner's point is that he had to incarnate now, Nero did, as this individual who was also at the head of an empire, but now who had to direct his destructive influences inward upon himself and destroy himself, and had to undergo that experience as an attempt at karmic balancing for the cruelties that he had inflicted on other people as Nero in a previous incarnation. And so I think we can begin to see here how these karmic relationships work themselves out through this law of balancing. If you're a serial killer in one life, chances are you're going to be the victim of a serial killer in another life. It's not a punishment. It's just simply what the soul desires from the other side to experience, to go through the full spectrum of human experiences. As Brian Weiss said, the psychotherapist guy who discovered through hypnotic regression how to access people's past lives, we've all been murderers and we've all been victims. None of us is innocent. We've all gone through these same processes over and over again. And he says that the soul just bounces back. It says, let's try again every time. You'll learn something new, no matter how difficult the life or what the incarnation is like. There's always something new to learn. So we'll leave it here for Karmic Relationships Volume 2 at the halfway point.